Look at the margins of your notebook. Like, why are they there? Obviously, it's just to write some side notes or for your teacher to put feedback. That's what I thought. But if you look this up online, a lot of sources on the internet say something a little weirder. Okay, a lot weirder.
Rodents eat pieces of information with the paper. People started to leave empty spaces around the edges, where the damage was most likely to happen. To save the written information from damage, people used to leave margin space to protect the written information.
Wait, is this even true? Margins were invented to prevent rats from eating the content of notebooks? We should do more research. Okay, so apparently rats did chew at the edges of at least some books. Here's an 11th century copy of writing from Boethius with actual rat bite marks all around the text. Ugh. But if you do a little more research, when book historians explain why margins were wide, they point to tradition, space for notes, room for rebinding. I mean, you won't be able to find a printer's manual that says, do it for the rodents. Margins are also crucial for some printing processes, ensuring there's a safe space on the margin in case of paper movement. So margins exist for many different reasons, some of which may not apply today, but tradition is a valid reason too. While rats did chew up some margins, and they did sometimes prevent content from being lost, it's highly unlikely this was the primary driving force behind their invention. The point is, it's complicated, and the possible factors are numerous. Why does the rat-proof story spread so much? There's a funny word I like called teleology. It just means explaining things in terms of the purpose they serve rather than the cause that brought them about. An example would just be like a kid explaining that the sun rises because we need something to wake us up. Sure, the sun rising does wake us up. That's a purpose it serves, but it's not a good explanation. We know it rises because the earth spins, but obviously kids aren't the only ones privy to these kinds of explanations. I think we prefer explanations in terms of purpose rather than causes because we deal with purposes and results more in our day-to-day lives. Margins exist so that rats eat paper, not prose. That's a fun and interesting purpose, even when the real causes are messier. That reflex is exactly what Jorge Luis Borges called teleological thinking. In his 1932 essay, Narrative Art and Magic, he points out how we often instinctively think teleologically. But the examples he used weren't rats eating notebooks. They were much more pervasive and honestly changed the way I see the world. What were his examples of teleological thinking? All of fiction. And magic. Borges starts with the belief in magic, the old anthropologist's kind, not the Las Vegas kind. Think voodoo dolls or rain dances. You prick a doll so your enemy hurts. You do a dance so nature is happy with you. If you judge an act by the result it's meant to achieve rather than the mechanism that could actually make it happen, you're thinking teleologically. He quotes James Frazer's law of sympathy. Things act at a distance because they share a likeness or past contact. For a more modern example, think about the superstition of throwing salt over your shoulder. If you think in terms of literal cause and effect, it doesn't make any sense at all. But teleological thinking can explain it. The purpose of throwing the salt is to ward off bad luck, so we'll do it. Borges argues most spells and superstitions are born the same way. People have fears or cravings they can't solve with ordinary means, so we invent a magical action whose job is to fix the problem. The function is the entire proof. If the aim is protection, the salt goes flying. End of logic. That's what makes it magic. The ritual's power isn't in how it works, but why it's performed. Now for the juice. How is fiction teleological? Well, unlike the real world, fiction is by definition purpose-driven, because fiction is written by a person. It doesn't just unfold due to natural causes. Authors don't craft details because of actual historical or physical causes, but instead choose events, characters, and details based on the purpose they serve within the narrative. A novelist isn't a physicist, calculating the next state of the world based on prior conditions. When they reach a blank page, they don't ask, what's the most statistically probable thing to happen next? They ask, what is the purpose of this story? In other words, what do I want the reader to feel right now? And the answer, tension, wonder, heartbreak, becomes the compass. Then scenes, dialogue, even weather bend toward that emotional north. Fiction flows from purpose first, probability later, because the whole point of storytelling is to deliver an interesting experience, not to run a simulation of ordinary lives. Even if a writer concocts some ridiculous coincidence to move the story forward, we can often accept the move if it serves a greater purpose. If the story ends up being cool, satisfying, or interesting, just a good story. In short, Borges reveals fiction and magic to be two expressions of the same human impulse, to impose meaningful purpose upon reality, transcending literal cause and effect relationships in favor of symbolic significance and narrative coherence. Both fiction and magic leverage our natural inclination to interpret the world according to purpose rather than strict causality. In a blog post reviewing the essay, Dawson Eliason said it better than I ever could. It is quintessential Borges, the remarkable clarity and retrospective obviousness of it, the way it has one foot in the rigorously academic and another in delightfully fantastical. He's essentially saying that reading is magic, but not in the way that this is said in elementary school libraries to convince kids that reading is fun. Rather, in a way that explains the psychological wonder of literature, by examining its philosophical structure, as well as that of magic. And he does this in 7 pages. That was basically Borges' argument, but once you apply the lens of teleological thinking, you can't stop seeing it everywhere you look. Like, this probably isn't the first time you've watched a YouTube video debunking an internet myth. It's easy to write these off as catchy but misguided trivia, sometimes randomly spread due to quirks and mechanisms of the internet. But with so many that pop up so often, I think it starts to reveal traces of our psychology. While we're talking about mechanisms of the internet, it's wild to think that nearly 3 billion people in the world have never even been online. No Google, no YouTube, no Borges essays to stumble into by accident. There's a nonprofit that reached out to me after my last video called GiveInternet. Please don't click ahead. This is not sponsored. I am not making any money from this. I just think what they're doing is really cool. GiveInternet provides internet access and laptops to students in underserved communities and refugee camps in Asia and Africa, giving them the tools to dive into the same rabbit holes the rest of us take for granted. Once connected, students can go on to find jobs, freelance, or start businesses. Things that would be nearly impossible without internet access. If you want to check it out, they gave me a custom link in the description, and every donation made through that link gets matched up to $30,000. Just think about how much we learn and discover on the internet, and how even today not everyone gets that opportunity. Okay, so back to YouTube and all these misconception debunking videos. Many internet myths carry the same flavor of teleological thinking. Borges offers us a framework to critically examine the purpose-driven thinking we lean on so often in our lives, but also to appreciate the beauty and efficiency of it where it does make sense. Earlier this week, I was walking around Brooklyn and saw a pair of shoes dangling from a power line. What are they doing there? The answers online are so incredibly mixed, ranging from a memorial to a dead person in the neighborhood to a call sign for drug dealing. These are all interesting purposes that we're giving to shoes on power lines, and one of them might even be true in this case. But if I just chose one of those answers to explain this specific pair of shoes, I'd be making the mistake of working backwards from potential purposes for the shoes rather than forwards from potential causes. Why would somebody throw a pair of shoes to a power line in the middle of Williamsburg? If you think for a bit, seriously, I doubt it's a memorial or a marker for drug dealers. Maybe a kid just saw a pair like this before, dangling from another power line, and so they decided to copy it for fun. Or since those look like climbing shoes next to a climbing gym, maybe somebody used that pair until they fell apart and decided to throw them up rather than throw them out. But I can't really know the reason without serious investigation or asking the person who did it. That's the unfortunate thing. In real life, causes often tangle into complex knots we may never unravel, so we'll lean on teleology to make sense of what we see. But that's real life. If your story unfolds from fiction, not physics, if every element is deliberate, its purpose is clear as day. Again, I've been outdone by someone online. Reddit user Thelonious Cube had this to say about Borges' essay. In other words, fiction creates a world that makes sense to us in the ways that we wish the real world would. By the way, why is this gun here?